Hello, everyone, and welcome back to ShiftED Talks, a podcast by GradRight. In today's episode, we are joined by Professor Emeritus Philip Altbach, founding director of the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College. With over 50 years of teaching and research experience in global higher education, Professor Altbach shares his deep insights into the mass expansion of global universities, their challenges over the last half-century, the growth of joint degree programs across the world, especially in India, and the role of international collaboration in the future of higher education. Plus, Professor Altbach offers his thoughts on how the evolving political climate, especially for the US and Europe, will shape the future of global higher education for many years to come. This is an episode you won't want to miss. Welcome, Philip. It's very, very nice to have you here. So I'm wondering if you can give us a brief background. I would say a couple of highlights on your journey, as well as maybe briefly tell us a little bit about the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College, of which you're the founding director.
Yes, well, it's a great pleasure to be talking to an audience, at least in part in India, because I have been working on Indian education as an observer and researcher for, believe it or not, more than half a century. So it's a real pleasure to be with you all today. When I joined the faculty at Boston College in the early 1990s, I was convinced that our knowledge in the United States about higher education in the rest of the world was lacking extremely. So I started a research center at Boston College, which is still going strong, with the idea of trying to understand what's going on in higher education at the beginning for an American audience, but later for a global audience in higher education. And it so happens that this was the beginning of the era of globalization. So it was a really important time to begin to understand how universities around the world and higher education systems more generally interacted with one another. And it's been a really interesting journey of trying to understand and trying to build networks of colleagues and researchers in different countries. So our center at Boston College, it's a research center. We have a well-regarded kind of magazine about higher education issues, which is translated now into 4 different languages. That's it.
So thank you for some of that information. So you yourself said, I believe you said half a century in these topics. So someone who has really seen the ebbs and flows, let's say, of student mobility, of higher education throughout the world, such affecting or effectual event that saw either a major sort of burst of students going globally around the world to study outside of their home countries, and just some details around that, and how you and how the center evaluated the situation.
Well, I think there are 2 fundamental underlying factors that have shaped global higher education in the years that we've been active. And those are, first of all, the expansion of higher education, what's called massification. And we need to keep in mind there are now 250 million students who are studying in post-secondary education globally. Now, massification, of course, started actually in North America as early as the 1920s and 30s, but really got going after the Second World War. And countries, especially in the global south, and especially in China and now in India, are rapidly expanding. So we have in the rich world, 70, 80% in many cases of the relevant age group going on to post-secondary ed. And China has now reached over half, and India has, as we know, in the national education program, the goal of getting up to 50% in just a few years. So India and China will account for the major expansion in higher education in the coming years. Just two countries. Of course, they're the biggest populations in the world.
That's right. Yeah.
So we've had massification, and this has gone everywhere. The other one, which is related to broader globalization, is the globalization of science and of higher education. So, and part of this is the expansion of student mobility around the world. There are now more than 6 million students who are studying outside the borders of their own countries for many, many different reasons. In some countries, the capacity at home doesn't exist. In some countries, students feel that they can't get the quality that they want in their home country, so they go overseas. In some countries, students go overseas to study with the desire of not returning home. And I think that's something which isn't much discussed, but is a reality of motivations for mobility. So there are push and pull factors. So global student mobility is an important part of what's happened in higher education. But the globalization of science means much more, because we've got, and in India is an interesting case here, we've got many more scientific collaborations in terms of publications and articles and so on, authored by scholars in more than one country. We've seen the rise, especially of China, as a major scientific power. We've seen it isn't a decline, but some people see it that way, of the major Western countries, including the United States, in terms of the proportion of scientific publications, which doesn't mean, for example, that Americans are publishing fewer articles. It just means that other countries are publishing more articles. And that's a win-win. That's a good thing for everybody. So we've also seen the rise of branch campuses around the world, mainly of universities in rich countries, which have, for a variety of reasons, established branches in other parts of the world.
We talk about this massification and the great and ongoing rise, probably with a few dips here and there, of international student mobility. And a big part of the conversation today, on the domestic front, in the US anyway, is this dreaded enrollment cliff, which of course relates to a drop in birth rates. I believe it's between 2008 and 2011, and what that means for student enrollments in the U.S. And I'm wondering if you can see that tendency or that trend, or that fear in any case, when it comes to other countries' systems.
Absolutely. And of course, it's a big issue in the US. And if you want, we can talk a little bit more about the details of that. But you can see the same demographic trend starting in full force now in Europe, which in fact has significantly lower population growth rates than the US does. And the US, of course, has been boosted by significant migration to the US in recent years. And what that's going to mean in the forthcoming Trump era,
Yes.
we really don't know, but we can speculate, I think, with reasonable accuracy about that. But the direct answer to your important question is this is not just a U.S. issue; it's a rich country issue, and it's beginning to be a middle-income country issue because China, South Korea, Japan, and South Korea and Japan, by the way, have the world's lowest population increased rates, and universities in Japan and beginning in South Korea, private ones, are going out of business in a big way. So this is an extremely important global trend. And what it will mean for global student mobility from countries like India to the rest of the world and to the U.S. is a very interesting and unanswerable question at the moment. Because, and it's also to talk about the U.S. just for a moment, our top universities have no problems with obtaining good quality domestic and international students. They're well known globally, they're well known within the country, they're in good financial shape, generally speaking, both the public ones and the private ones, and they do just fine. The problem, of course, is at the lower end of the system, and it's both public and private colleges and universities are suffering, many of them, severe enrollment declines. Some are going out of business, and they are looking more and more toward an international market. But the international market is not so interested in low-end public and private universities. That's true in Europe, and it's true in the U.S., despite the fact that the quality, at least in America, of these sort of mid-tier public and privates, especially publics, is actually quite good.
Yes.
So if you go to a non-name brand public institution in the United States, you're going to get a good education, and in some ways just as good as if you go to a top-tier institution at the undergraduate level.
Thank you very much. And we see so many students in our line of work, and one thing that's very important for us is to give students a very clear and transparent view of the programs and universities that align with all kinds of needs and preferences of theirs. And these turn out to be not always these top ranked universities. I assume when you say top, there is a certain there are a set of parameters there. Am I right?
Yes, and we don't want to spend too much time on the rankings,
Yes.
the global rankings, but they are important, and parents and students in all countries look at them.
Yes.
And in my view, I've even co-edited a book on rankings, that there's much too much attention paid to them. And if you sort of unpeel the methodologies of some of the rankings, it's not particularly accurate in my view. So people in India and elsewhere pay too much attention to the rankings, and I think that the service that you and others provide in terms of linking students with a range of universities that will meet their particular interests is quite important, and we should all pay less attention to the rankings. Now,
Yes.
understanding what's going on at a mid-tier university, whether it's in America or a university of applied science in Germany or in the Netherlands, that's not so easy because they're not name brands, yet they're often offering specialties, curricula, support services which are important for students and very relevant to the job market in both in their own countries and probably with skills that they can bring back home.
That's
so
right.
It's complicated.
Yes.
But if I had one thing to say is don't focus on the rankings, please.
I think what you're, what I take from that is something that we are working to do, and I think people who are invested in the student experience and the lives of the actual students themselves, is to really rethink how data information is channeled in the sector between institutions and students, between banks and students as well. There seems to be a crisis of communication, I would say, which is driving students and their parents to necessarily so depend on things like rankings for lack of access to other data that could be extremely beneficial to them. And there are many missed opportunities there, as I see it.
Yes, I completely agree. Furthermore, there are lots of people in this industry, because it's now an industry,
Yes.
Of guiding students to overseas universities and programs who are what I would say bad actors, providing not good information, charging fees for not very useful information, and so on. At the same time, as you say, and I think quite correctly, it's a crisis of communication, which is very odd because here we are in a world of over communication, and
Yes.
yet finding accurate, as you say, transparent information about particular programs and universities is difficult, partly because the institutions themselves, many of them, do not do a good job of communicating what they offer and what exists, partly because there's some amount of, how to put it, not exactly misinformation, but maybe not complete information about costs, about programs, about quality, and so on. So it's a difficult marketplace, and I think we're at a point where it's tough for the customer, that is a student and their families, to figure out what's best. So what they do, of course, is back to the rankings.
Yes.
They look at that, and of course there are a million different rankings, which the big ones, which we're referring to, but also many different rankings on sustainable development, on what's the best business school, and so on. Some of them are pretty good. Many of them are worthless. So it's an oversupply of underprepared information, if you will.
Can you share a little bit just on your view? It's difficult to give a prediction, like you've said yourself. We don't know, and we can't say. So perhaps I ask you: is there, in terms of sharing information, is there anything that you would advise to universities with regard to their communications? About the situation, about the possible conflicts that may come into play, and also I'd love to hear, your general approach to this issue.
Well, let me start out from a global point of view.
Please.
In the Anglosphere countries, and you've mentioned several, the UK, Canada, you might add Australia
That's right.
to that, and the US. There are all negative developments relating to international student mobility. The Brits cannot decide how much to charge. They have placed restrictions on whether international students can bring family members to the
Right.
country. and this has affected apparently Nigerian applications significantly in the UK. And so on. So there's kind of a lack of clarity and negative direction there. First point. Canada, big time negative developments, stimulated in significant part because of housing shortages, for the country in general and for students, and focused especially on colleges, vocational colleges in Canada, not much on the universities, but the universities are affected. So the numbers of students who will be admitted to Canada has decreased, and they are going to soon have an election, and it's likely that the current government will not prevail, and the conservatives will win, and they will, like most conservatives, have a more restrictive immigration policy. So I think there are problems there. Australia is crazy at the moment. Yes. Because the current government put into place a policy modestly restrictive on student mobility, and then the parliament said no. So I think there's a rethink on how the Australians are going to approach this, but in my view, it can't be particularly positive. It might not be as negative as it started out being. And finally, let's go to the United States. It's very clear to me that there will be further restrictions in the second Trump era on internet on migration in general, and I think student mobility will be caught up in that problem, at least to some extent. I think,
or for certain countries, let's say,
especially for certain countries, but in general. So I think there's no question about that. We should keep in mind, however, that even at the present time, during the so-called, the generally liberal Biden administration, I've read that 36% of student visa applications, this is globally, are turned down. Now, I think a little less for India than for Africa, but still the numbers are very significant. So that's the political context absolutely is going to be negative. There's no question. How negative, we don't know. How much the Trump administration life is not going to be good. And they're trying to help as much as they can. So that's the rather unpleasant, I think, prospects in the Anglosphere. In other European countries, it's really quite interesting. Confusion in a number of countries about the broader migration issues. And as you have right-wing populist governments increasingly successful in Western Europe, you're going to have more restrictions on migration in general and student mobility in particular. So I guess, I could talk for the whole session about this, but the bottom line is it's complicated and overall not particularly positive, especially in the Anglosphere.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you for the sort of broader picture. I think it's important that we step out of this, Anglo-centric mindset and look at what's really going on. And you're the right person to speak to. Perhaps it's my optimism getting the best of me, but, in terms of how institutions may cope with tighter restrictions, may cope with, policies that will prevent international students from entering their borders or their campuses. Do you see, for instance, dual degrees, or for instance, in India, several universities abroad have, like you mentioned earlier, have campuses in India, where the level and quality of information is purportedly, similar or the same as that in the U.S. Do you see this as one potential opportunity to sort of maintain the ideals of a globalized education? Um, and if so, sort of how do you imagine that?
Yeah, I think that's a really important and interesting question, and it has a variety of aspects to it. First of all, the branch campus movement has expanded quite significantly in recent years. Um, I forget the number, but I think it's more than 200 branch campuses all around the world. Basically, none of them in India. And I can relate, I can talk a bit about that in a moment. Uh, I think the branch campus movement has sort of slowed down a little bit. And what we're seeing um, is the rapid expansion of joint degree programs
Right.
with local institutions in many different countries. And I think in the India case, that's going to be the biggest opening, and to me, a very positive one, because I don't, I mean, the NEP, of course, has opened the door, in quotation marks, to branch campuses in India. I personally don't think there's going to be many overseas universities, especially of the quality that India would like to see coming in that quote open door, um, coming in, because India is a difficult place to operate. The regulations in the new arrangements are, as usual, overly bureaucratic and a little bit unclear, and so on. So I think a lot of the top universities in other countries are going to see this as too much of a risk. Now, there are going to be a few, much going on there. What I think will go on, which has gone on for some time actually, is that overseas universities, including a number of top American universities, establishing research centers uh, uh, in, in India, so that they can provide partly information about their university to prospective students uh, in India who may want to go study there, providing a research base for their faculty members who want to do research in India and collaborate with Indian scholars as a base for joint degree programs and so on. So I think that's the future, not branch campuses. Of course, I could be wrong.
Well, I think in light of, you know, let's say a negative future in terms of policy and politics, certainly, um, you know, is there a way around issues like visa restrictions? I mean, is it possible? There's a partnership between a domestic and an international university, let's say from the US. Students can get that dual degree. In general, a student will, let's say it's for a graduate degree, MBA, for instance, a student will spend 1 year, for example, in India on the campus here, and then 1 year at the partnered university. Now, this seems to me, if there are visa restrictions, this is the same problem that we're running into. But is it possible? Is there a way to, if we're really feeling so strongly as we should about providing a globalized higher education? Is there a way around it, for instance, by offering, 2 weeks at a time um, research fellowships, let's say? Or how do we work with this? How do we get around this? Because we can certainly try and change it, and that must be part of the effort. And much more deeply about how that works. But for universities, how to cope then, rather than just sort of sitting and letting things fall where they may?
Well, the short answer is I have no idea. And
Hmm.
I think that, I mean, I'm not a big fan of very short term international, what you might call academic tourism,
Hmm.
um, in part because for global sustainability issues, is flying back and forth for 2 weeks
Yes,
is kind of, not great for the environment and so on. But more important, if you need a visa, you need a visa.
that's right.
And going for a short term, for a couple of weeks is probably not going to help very much. I suspect that over time, even in the Trump era, that the visa situation will calm down to some extent. And
Hmm.
I think that the idea of a student going, these joint degree programs, which, as we've discussed, I think are a more likely prospect than full branch campuses, that going to the home campus for a year and studying in India with a partner institution for a year, for example, for an MBA, that's probably going to continue. Or maybe even with more than two institutions. So if you've got
Hmm.
an American institution, an Indian institution, and maybe a German institution where the visa restrictions are non existent or much less, that it can be worked out that way. So clever thinking
Yes.
can help in these difficult times, no question. It's my pleasure, particularly to, having a conversation with you and with an Indian audience, at least in part. So I really appreciate that. Thanks.